There are moments in history when a nation doesn't just build a machine, it builds a message. And during the Cold War, when the Soviet Union was locked behind secrecy, fear, and nuclear ambition, the United States answered with one of the boldest aircraft ever conceived. The Lockheed U-2 was not just another airplane. It was a declaration that America would look over the Iron Curtain, stare directly into the heart of the Soviet Empire, and come back with answers. At a time when the world lived under the shadow of atomic war, when intelligence meant survival and uncertainty could lead to catastrophe, the U-2 became one of the most daring symbols of American ingenuity. It flew so high that it seemed to belong more to the edge of space than to the sky, carrying lone pilots into a realm where a small mistake could mean death, all in service of one mission: to reveal what America's greatest rival was hiding. To understand why the U-2 mattered so much, you have to go back to the 1950s, when the Cold War was still young and the United States faced a terrifying problem. The Soviet Union was building bombers, missiles, and nuclear weapons, but no one in Washington truly knew how much progress had been made, how many weapons the Soviets had, or how close they were to gaining a strategic advantage. The fear was not abstract. If American intelligence underestimated Soviet capabilities, the consequences could be catastrophic. But getting reliable information was nearly impossible. Soviet territory was vast, heavily defended, and shrouded in secrecy. Traditional reconnaissance aircraft could be intercepted. Human intelligence was limited. Satellites had not yet become the eyes in the sky we know today. So America needed something extraordinary, an aircraft capable of flying so high that Soviet fighters, missiles, and radar would struggle to stop it. Out of that need came the U-2, a spy plane so radical in its design that it looked less like a warplane and more like a glider built for the stratosphere. The U-2 was developed in secret by Lockheed's Skunk Works, the same legendary engineering team that would later create other iconic American aircraft. It was built around one central idea: altitude was survival. If the airplane could fly above 70,000 feet, it could operate beyond the practical reach of Soviet defenses, at least in theory. That required a design unlike almost anything else in military aviation. The aircraft was incredibly light, with long, slender wings that gave it a phenomenal lift-to-drag ratio, allowing it to climb to altitudes that seemed almost unreal for the time. Every pound mattered. Engineers stripped away unnecessary weight, and the result was a machine that could soar higher than any Soviet interceptor was expected to reach. In an era defined by brute force and heavy bombers, the U-2 represented a different kind of American power. Not just strength, but innovation, precision, and the willingness to solve impossible problems through engineering. What makes the U-2 story even more fascinating is that the aircraft was not initially embraced by the U.S. Air Force. In fact, the Air Force rejected the concept at first because it was a single-engine aircraft, unarmed, and didn't fit traditional military expectations. Instead, the Central Intelligence Agency became the first organization to operate it. That decision mattered because in the political world of the Cold War, appearances were everything. Sending a civilian-operated CIA aircraft over Soviet territory was considered less provocative than sending a U.S. military plane. President Dwight Eisenhower understood the danger of every mission he approved. The world had only recently emerged from the devastation of the Second World War, and another major conflict, especially one between nuclear powers, could be apocalyptic. But he also knew that ignorance was dangerous. If the United States did not know what the Soviets were building, how many bombers they had, or where their missile sites were located, American leaders would be making decisions in the dark. So beginning in 1956, the U-2 began some of the most daring overflights in modern history. Those early missions were acts of calculated audacity. U-2 pilots flew deep over Soviet territory, photographing airfields, bomber bases, missile installations, and industrial facilities that Western intelligence had never seen clearly before. The aircraft's cameras were masterpieces in their own right, capable of capturing remarkably detailed images from extreme altitude. From tens of thousands of feet above the Earth, the U-2 could gather the kind of intelligence that shaped military planning, foreign policy, and the strategic balance of the Cold War. These flights helped the United States cut through exaggerated fears and propaganda. They provided hard evidence about Soviet capabilities and exposed the reality behind many of the Kremlin's claims. In that sense, The U-2 was more than a spy plane. It was a weapon against uncertainty. It gave America one of the most valuable advantages in geopolitics, the ability to replace fear with knowledge. But the idea that the U-2 was invisible to Soviet defenses turned out to be only partially true. The Soviets could detect the aircraft more effectively than American planners had hoped, even if bringing it down at those altitudes was another matter. That tension hung over every mission. Every flight over the Soviet Union was a gamble, because if the aircraft was shot down or the pilot captured, the political consequences could be enormous. And in 1960, that gamble finally went wrong. On May 1st of that year, CIA pilot Francis Gary Powers took off on what was supposed to be another reconnaissance mission over Soviet territory. Instead, his U-2 was struck by a Soviet surface-to-air missile at roughly 70,000 feet. The mission collapsed into one of the most famous intelligence disasters of the Cold War. Powers survived the incident by ejecting and parachuting to the ground, only to be captured by the Soviets. His survival created a nightmare for Washington, because the United States could no longer deny the nature of the mission. The aircraft, the pilot, and the evidence were all in Soviet hands. The Gary Powers incident sent shockwaves around the world. It exposed the reality of American overflights, embarrassed the Eisenhower administration, and inflamed tensions between Washington and Moscow at a time when both sides were already armed with nuclear weapons. Powers was put on trial in the Soviet Union, sentenced to prison and hard labor, and became one of the most famous faces of the Cold War. Yet even in failure, the U-2 story revealed something powerful about the era and about the people who flew these missions. Powers and the pilots like him were operating at the absolute edge of human and mechanical limits. They climbed to altitudes where a decompression event could be fatal in seconds, where the margin between safe flight and disaster was razor thin, and where every mission carried the risk of capture, imprisonment, or death. Whatever one thinks about the politics of those flights, the courage involved is impossible to ignore. These were not routine operations. They were some of the most dangerous intelligence missions ever flown, carried out by men who knew exactly what could happen if something went wrong. And the aircraft itself was no less extraordinary. The U-2 remains one of the strangest and most demanding airplanes ever built. With its enormous wingspan and lightweight design, it behaves almost like a powered glider, which is exactly why it can reach such extreme altitudes. But that same design also makes it notoriously difficult to land. It uses a bicycle-style landing gear rather than a conventional setup, and because its wings generate so much lift at low altitude, the pilot must practically stall the aircraft onto the runway. During landing, a chase car follows behind, with another U-2 pilot or support officer calling out altitude and helping guide the aircraft down safely. Once it slows enough, one wingtip eventually drops toward the runway, and ground crews rush in to stabilize the aircraft with detachable support struts called pogos. It is a bizarre, almost theatrical process, but it reflects the truth of the U-2. This is not a normal airplane. It is a specialized machine designed for a single extraordinary purpose, and everything about it reflects that mission flying. The U-2 also means entering an environment that is dangerously close to space. At 70,000 feet, the atmosphere is so thin that pilots wear full pressure suits that resemble astronaut gear more than standard flight equipment. That is not for appearance, it is for survival. Above roughly 60,000 feet lies what is known as the Armstrong limit, the altitude at which atmospheric pressure becomes so low that water can boil at normal human body temperature. In a sudden loss of cabin pressure, an unprotected pilot would not simply feel discomfort. The situation could become fatal almost immediately. The pressure suit keeps the pilot alive in an environment where the sky darkens, the curvature of the Earth becomes visible, and the boundary between aviation and spaceflight begins to blur. In fact, the U-2's relationship to space goes even further. Before the first space shuttle mission in 1981, when NASA faced problems with its own suits, the agency turned to Beale Air Force Base and used modified U-2 pressure suits for the mission. So when we talk about the U-2, we are not just talking about a spy plane. We are talking about one of the boldest intelligence tools ever built, a machine that helped shape the balance of the Cold War from the skies above the Soviet Union.